corrupt, power-hungry globalists. You know what a globalist is, right? You know what a globalist is. A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that. You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist. Nationalist. Nothing else. Use that word. Use that word.
Nationalist, use that word. But what does it mean exactly? Today we'll be looking at this term nationalist and what it means by examining some reliable sources. Oh, hold on a sec. That's better. Hello again, this is Mr. Patriarch, and today we'll be talking about nationalism, what it means in the U.S. context, different kinds of nationalism, and so on. But before I do, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. It'll really help out the channel, and I'm trying to get this thing going. So now, let's dive into it. So for today, I've decided to go to an actual expert on nationalism instead of the sensationalist hyperventilating you're likely to find on mainstream media. We'll be going over a speech given at the 2019 H.L. Mencken Club by the now deceased professor of history, Jeffrey Michael Lipkes. Lipkes was a historian educated at UC Berkeley and Princeton University. The H.L. Mencken Club was founded by Professor Emeritus Paul Gottfried as a kind of bastion for dissident and/or purged right-wingers and academics in the United States. They meet annually and give speeches centered around a particular topic. In 2019, the club met, and the topic for the year was titled Regionalism versus Nationalism. Is a choice still possible? A variety of speakers gave talks around this topic, and the departed Professor Lipkes gave a speech titled The Varieties of Nationalism. For this video, I'm going to be reciting Professor Lipkes' speech that he gave, adapting it for YouTube, and providing a link in the description in case you wish to read the unedited version yourself. Here we go. I didn't know until an email exchange a little while ago that Paul would be talking about the virtues of nationalism, though I should have guessed. I'm going to say a few words about it as well because it provides a useful point of departure for the brief tour d'horizon of nationalisms I want to conduct. It's a book I wanted to like, but it's a book bound to be irritating for any historian and disappointing for a student of nationalism. It's not just that Hazoni's approach is highly schematic, it's simply ahistorical. For those who aren't familiar with it, Hazoni compares tribes, nations, and empires in a kind of Goldilocks fairy tale. Tribes inspire loyalty and affection among members and allow participation in governance, but are constantly at war with other tribes, and life is nasty, brutish, and short. The bowl of porridge is too hot. Empires promise peace and prosperity, but they're intolerant, repressive, and aggressive. The bowl of porridge is too cold. Imperialists, by the way, are big fans of Kant and Locke. Nations, however, are the bowl of porridge that's just right. Members feel something like the close bonds with others that tribal members feel, while nations, following the Marquis of Queensberry rules laid down by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, respect each other's sovereignty and leave each other alone, each peaceably pursuing its own unique path. Except, of course, they didn't and don't. Nations have not been so nice and empires so nasty, as he believes, and nations weren't formed by tribes getting together over a tankard of mead and shaking hands. I'll skip the details, but the wars that culminated in the Treaty of Westphalia were launched by nations against the empire, and almost before the ink was dry. France and Sweden, opponents of the imperial idea, began new wars of conquest, and certainly some empires were more tolerant than the nations that succeeded them. The motto of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at the end of the 19th century could have been Rodney King's famous plea, "Can't we all just get along?" What's annoying about the book is that there's no engagement with the vast literature on nationalism. Anyone presuming to write about the subject needs to read these books and address their arguments. The fundamental problem, though, is that Hazoni is calling nationalism what is actually one of several versions, and conflating it with still another nationalism, how the term is used today in Europe and the US. I've listed 6 versions of nationalism, and it's misleading to combine them. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about all of these, even summarily, but I do want to focus on one and contrast it with 3 through 5, which bear some similarity. What distinguishes the countries of 3 to 5 is that they became nations after the development of an ideology called nationalism. They're the nationalisms, originally, of marginal intellectuals, often a dangerous species, and later to become the nationalism of politicians and professors, no less dangerous. Zoni gets some things right, and one important thing he gets right is that nationalism, number 1, is inspired by the example of ancient Israel. He doesn't document it, though, and doesn't appreciate the consequences. What distinguishes nationalism 1 from the new nationalisms is that it is derived from the Bible. The nationalisms of the professors, nationalisms 3 through 5, are romantic post-Christian movements. Indeed, they have frequently been viewed as surrogate religions. The second difference is that English and British nationalism is spurred by the fear of invasion. The other nationalisms involve unification of independent kingdoms, or, more frequently, independence from an empire. Here's a list of the invasions that helped form English national consciousness. German nationalism was also inspired by a French invasion, but it was a very different France the Germans were responding to. A third difference. Under Elizabeth and then a Protestant dynasty that subordinated itself to Parliament, royalty became identified with the nation. That's why there's still a Queen of England. I was going to summarize at this point the debate between the primordialists, or primevalists, and the modernists, 2 schools of thought about nationalism that are the successors to the original opponents, the nationalists themselves and the Marxists, which I was also going to summarize. There's no time for that, but the important takeaway, because of its impact today, is the transition in Marxist thinking from hostility to all forms of nationalism, seen as a ploy by the bourgeoisie to divert workers from class struggle and their kinship with all workers, to the selective endorsement of some nationalisms, namely those that undermine the West. Leftists have made much use of the phrase lifted from Benedict Anderson called imagined communities. This enables them to claim that invented post-World War II nationalities like Kosovars, Bosnians, or Palestinians are as legitimate as the English, whose national consciousness can be traced back to the 9th century when King Alfred the Great reigned. Alfred is regarded as the father of the English nation, not only for defeating the Danish invaders, uniting the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and codifying their laws, but for beginning to translate the Bible and some Latin literature into the vernacular. More than anything else, it's the translation of the Bible into English that stimulates and shapes English nationalism. Some historians have emphasized the Wycliffe Bible of the late 14th century, but it's really the Tyndale-Coverdale Bible, first published in 1535, that's the game changer. First, because it's the first printed version, and second, because the translation comes at the dawn of the Reformation, which inspired it and which it in turn promotes. It goes through 91 editions with some emendations, but it's finally revised as the King James Version in 1611. The word nation appears 454 times in the King James Version, but only around 100 times in the Latin Vulgate, which Wycliffe used. The example of the Hebrew nation of the Old Testament becomes enormously attractive for the English. They come to share the belief that they're the chosen people, that God has entered into a covenant with them that depends on their being a righteous nation, and if they are, they'll help usher in a messianic era. There are quotations for you to read at your leisure. The pocket Bible Cromwell issued to his troops consisted almost exclusively of excerpts from the Old Testament. Queen Elizabeth called herself the nursing mother of Israel. She also replaced the figure of Christ on the cross in parish churches with the royal coat of arms. Protestantism was nationalism. The English 4th of July is Guy Fawkes Night, November 5th, when, into the 19th century, the Pope was burned in effigy. But what's also important and ignored by Hazony is the way the necessity of reading the Bible for oneself shaped English nationalism. In the first place, it means that liberty of conscience is a key ingredient. The radical individualism that he attributes to Locke is baked into English nationalism. Milton's Areopagitica, from which the first quote comes, is a plea for freedom of the press against the censorship imposed by the Licensing Act of 1643. Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties, Milton wrote. In Fox's Book of Martyrs, the most widely read book after the Bible for 200 years, what's striking is the number of martyrs who are ordinary men and women, apprentices, tailors, shoekeepers, housewives, widows. They know Scripture better than the bishops who interrogate them. They also have the wherewithal to make cogent arguments. Milton also wrote, "He who destroys a good book kills reason itself." When the English become the people of the book, this encourages critical thinking. While the relationship of Puritanism to the scientific spirit is contested, almost to the extent of its relationship to the spirit of capitalism, the English become proud of being reasonable, practical, innovative, and, as a result, prosperous. Francis Bacon is hailed as the new Aristotle. The, quote, moderns are championed over the, quote, ancients. Empiricism, like libertarianism, is baked into English nationalism. It's Protestantism and the fear of invasion or domination by Catholic powers, along with the opportunity to profit from the empire, that creates Britain out of England, Wales, and Scotland, in Linda Colley's classic account. I want to cut belatedly to a definition of nation, to look at how many states are actually nation states, and then think about why. A nation is a community sharing, or believing it shares, a common ancestry. This makes sense, since the Latin root of nation refers to birth. But there's some confusion about this, and the source of confusion is obvious, because in common parlance, the term means state or country, as well as people. You could look at the League of Nations, the United Nations, the NFL, National Football League, etc. When we look at this table, we see that in over half of the countries, fewer than 75% of the people are of one nation or ethnic group. This has changed somewhat since the early 70s with the breakup of Yugoslavia, but Russia today still has 186 nations within it and is only about 80% Russian. There are two reasons for this. It turned out that when push came to shove after the collapse of the four empires at the end of World War I, the so-called nationalists from Eastern Europe at Versailles, in the Middle East during the interwar years, and in Africa and Asia during the decolonization after World War II, all of these nations were intent on grabbing as much territory as possible, regardless of the nationalities living there. They randomly used historical, linguistic, or geographic argument, or simply took over the boundaries created by the colonial powers without offering any rationale. But the second reason has to do with the liberality and reasonableness of the Anglo-American nationalism. For those who are my generation, when we were growing up, Americans still believed in a common ancestry of sort. George Washington and company were referred to as the Founding Fathers. We had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. We sang "My country 'tis of thee," "Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride." We may not have known what "'tis of thee" meant, but we accepted without raised eyebrow our implied common descent, that we were in some way the offspring of Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and the Pilgrims. The Founding Fathers certainly believed they were brothers and the siblings of the English. In the Declaration of Independence, after the famous problematic opening lines of paragraph 2, there's a long list of grievances against King George, 27 in all, each with its own paragraph. Finally, in the next to last paragraph, exasperation is vented against the English themselves, not the king, from paragraph 31 of the Declaration of Independence. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our English brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarranted jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity. We have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity, meaning blood ties, for the audience. Also, in the Federalist Papers, there are also appeals to common ancestry, to brotherhood, and in defense of a stronger, more centralized government. But this is important. Even in 1776, there was the recognition that the ties of kinship were symbolic. Paragraph 7 of the grievances. He, meaning the king, has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither. The king is attacked for being anti-immigration in paragraph 7 of the Declaration. This grievance comes before taxation without representation, usually represented as a core complaint of the revolutionaries, which is only mentioned in paragraph 17. The foreigners Jefferson had in mind were no doubt Germans, Swedes, and Dutch. Pennsylvania in the first census of 1790 was more than 60% German. But eventually, children of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe accepted they were in some sense descendants of Washington and Company. Then the age of multiculturalism arrived. The founders were vilified, America was vilified, and this sense of identity disappeared. And when immigrants arrive in large number, whose hostility to the West is part of their culture, or whose values are so strongly ethnocentric as to make them incapable of identifying with others, the bonds further disintegrate. France is one of the canaries in the mine. Once upon a time, Algeria was guarded as France Outre-mer, just another province. Algerian children learning French recited a line about our ancestors, the Gauls. That didn't work, and now France Outre-mer has come to Paris. Saint-Denis, where the kings of France from the 11th century are buried, is now a no-go zone. Tourists go there at their peril. The fear of invasion by a people with alien beliefs was a stimulus for Nationalism I, our inheritance. This fear is clearly behind the revival of nationalism in Europe and America today.